I'm Matt Zwolinski. I'm an associate professor of philosophy here at the University of San Diego and a co-director of USD's Institute for Law and Philosophy and a graduate of Arizona's PhD program in philosophy back in 2003.
I remember having conversations after the 9/11 attacks. I mean, within days of the attacks, and people were talking about, gasoline prices going up, and there was a lot of outrage over that, saying that it was a kind of price gouging. And here we are, people are exploiting this tragedy to try to make more money on fuel. Um, so let me ask you this question. How can it be okay to hike prices on essential goods during an emergency? I mean, that's when people need these things most. Shouldn't merchants be charging the same price? If anything, shouldn't merchants be charging a lower price if they were acting with a good conscience?
Right. So, so here's what I take to be the important grain of truth in that argument, right? When emergencies strike, when people are placed in a vulnerable position, good people ought to try to do what they can to help them, right? And when we see acts of price gouging, it looks like people are doing precisely the opposite. It looks like people are taking advantage of vulnerability to line their own pockets. And that strikes us as not just morally wrong, it strikes us as morally repugnant. So that, I think, is what's going on with a lot of people's thoughts on price gouging. And as I said, there's an important grain of truth there. We ought to try to help people who need our help. What happens, though, if we freeze prices in the wake of disasters, as anti-price gouging laws will sometimes do, or we insist that people lower their prices, is not necessarily that people get helped. In fact, it might actually hurt the very people that we're trying to help. So what you want to happen in an emergency is for stuff to go to the people who needs it most, stuff like electrical generators or water bottles or sandbags or whatever it is. The problem is that in an emergency situation, there's almost never enough stuff to go around. So someone's not going to get the stuff they need, and charging a low price for the stuff doesn't change that fact. It just means that the stuff's going to be snapped up by whoever stumbles across it first. So if you're selling water for 50 cents a bottle, let's say, when I think power might be out for a week, I might not just buy a bottle. I might buy a whole stock of water just to be on the safe side in case the power is out longer than I expect. Now, higher prices don't guarantee that stuff is going to go to the people who need it, but it does two things to help. First, higher prices encourage consumers to conserve. My house, for instance, is damaged in a storm, and hotel rooms cost $50 a night. I might very well buy one room for my wife and I and another room for my kids just to be comfortable. But if rooms cost $200 a night, I'll probably crowd us all into the same room. I might even decide that my damaged house isn't that bad after all, and I'll just stay home and tough it out for a night or two. Right? When consumers conserve, when they don't consume as much stuff as they could, then there's more stuff left for people who might need it more. The second thing that high prices do, the second way in which high prices might actually help people in need, is by encouraging potential suppliers to bring more stuff to the market. So if I could buy a bottle of water for 50 cents in San Diego and sell it for $5 in Los Angeles, it might be worth it for me to make a trip. Right? People are incredibly benevolent and kind, I think, when disasters strike in the United States. But I think if you really want to help to get stuff where it's needed, you don't want to rely on benevolence alone. You want to make it in people's self-interest to help. And price increases can do that in one important way.
Okay, so let's suppose that prices go up and that's actually good for people who are in greatest need. But of course, the people setting those prices are merchants, and they're not looking after those needs. They're just looking after their own interests. Why shouldn't there be somebody else, some impartial third party, a government agency, say, or a law that sets those prices in times of emergency?
Right, and in a way, that's exactly what anti-gouging laws try to do,
Hmm.
right? So those states that have anti-gouging laws effectively set a maximum price on a variety of emergency-related goods, sometimes listed explicitly and sometimes just categorized in a general way. Sometimes they say that no price increases are permitted after the governor typically has declared a state of emergency. Sometimes they say that price increases are limited to 10%, or sometimes they say that price increases are limited to whatever the good costs plus a certain amount. But all of them try to set in some way a legally maximum price that merchants can charge. And there's two kind of pragmatic problems, I think, with doing this. Um, well, sorry, one big pragmatic problem I'll just classify as one. The most significant problem is this: nobody really has any idea what the price ought to be on certain goods in order to achieve the outcome that they want, namely getting stuff to the people who needs it, right? So suppose your city's just suffered a blackout and people are snapping up electrical generators. Where do you set the price, right? Do you cap it at 10% over its prior price, 20%? Do you set a price cap on flashlights too? If so, is it the same amount? Is it less? Is it more? How you want to get enough of a price increase in the allowed in the system to encourage people to conserve on scarce resources. You also want to, again, allow enough of a price increase to provide an incentive for people to actually sell the stuff. But it's very, very difficult, in fact, arguably impossible for anyone sitting in an office by themselves to come up with that price. So what we have in a market system is we have a bunch of people coming up with prices on their own, and this process of competition kind of sorts out good prices from the bad. It's exactly the kind of thing that Friedrich Hayek was talking about in his famous article on the use of knowledge in society, where he thought that the sort of abolition of prices in a centrally planned socialist economy would make economic planning impossible. This is the same problem just on a smaller scale. Prices convey useful information about supply and demand, but only if those prices are allowed to emerge freely from the actions of buyers and sellers in the market. If you try to substitute those prices, the commands of a legislator, that legislator is going to be acting largely in the dark.
Hmm. Okay, so perhaps it should be merchants who set prices, but merchants can set their prices anywhere they want. Um, so what am I, as someone who might be facing a disaster and I have all kinds of things that I need or my family needs, my children needs, how am I to know that I'm going to be able to afford those things?
Well, you won't always be able to afford them. I mean, one of the virtues of higher prices is that they help people, even those who can't afford to pay the higher price, right? So if electrical generators are selling for $1,500 in the wake of a hurricane, and you can't afford to pay that $1,500, then you don't get the generator. But what one thing that $1,500 does is prevent you from buying the generator. Another thing it does, though, is it signals more people to bring generators into the market because, hey, there's a huge profit here to be made. However, the more people bring generators into the market, the higher supply of generators is, and the lower price generators go. So kind of paradoxically, you benefit from high prices even when you can't afford to pay them. But what's to stop merchants from charging whatever they want on a good? Well, in a sense, nothing. There's no legal prohibition, but in a sense, there is something. So one of the cases I talk about in my price gouging paper involves some kids who bought a bunch of ice for it was ice or water, I forget what it was, for like $1.70 a bag in one town, and then drove it to another town that had been hit by a hurricane
Hmm.
and sold it for $12 a bag. Now that seems nasty, right? But well, why didn't they sell it for $20 a bag? Why didn't they sell it for $50 a bag? Clearly, there are some forces there that were operating to check their naked self-interest or at least constrain their naked self-interest to prevent them from charging just whatever they wanted for the goods that people needed.
Okay, so suppose I'm one of the people living in this town that's just been hit by a hurricane and I need ice, perhaps, to keep my medicine preserved or something like that. and somebody comes along and they're selling it for $12 a bag. Now, I can afford that. Okay, so I pay the $12 and off I go. But of course, if somebody came up to me in the night and put a knife in my back and said, your wallet or your life, well, I could afford to give them my wallet, right? But that's clearly an illegitimate exchange. So why aren't these two kinds of exchanges in just the same bag?
Right, right. With the mugger, you're given his threat of your money or your life, you really are better off giving him your wallet than you are keeping it. So why isn't this just another case of mutually beneficial exchange? So the difference is between threats and offers, right? What the mugger does is threaten you, and a threat is something that proposes to make you worse off than you already are, unless you do what the threatener requests of you. So the mugger threatens to make you worse off than you were before, right? Before you had both your money and your life and you got to keep both. He's saying, unless you hand over wallet, I guess you get to keep neither, right? Now, presumably after he kills you, he'll take your wallet too. That's how a threat works. Price gouging, though, doesn't really involve threats. Price gouging involves offers, and offers are proposals that make you better off if you do what the proposer suggests, right? So a price gouger offers you a product and says, if you want to hand over your money in exchange for this product, you can do so. If you don't, of course, right? If you don't want to hand over your money for the product, well, you don't have to, right? So the difference is, once a proposal comes along, you're no worse off if you reject it than you would have been if the proposal had never come along in the first place. And if it's a good proposal, you might be better off if you take it. That's not the way threat works.
Okay. Matt, one more question. I'm trying to think of how price gouging laws affect commerce. So, for instance, imagine two neighboring states. One has price gouging laws. The other doesn't have any price gouging laws. Does that make any difference to corporations who are trying to decide where to sell their goods?
You'd think a priori that it would, but I really wish there was more good empirical work on this subject than there is. There just isn't much. I don't know if it's just because it's very difficult to run these kind of studies or what the explanation is, but if any economists are watching this, I hope they go out and do this kind of work. Most of the evidence we have, unfortunately, is just theoretical, right? So I can tell you a theoretical story about why it should make a difference, or it's anecdotal. But I mean, we have some good anecdotes, right? So there was a state of emergency declared in West Virginia in 2009, and once the state of emergency was declared, this set the state's anti-gouging laws into effect, and that limited price increases on certain classes of goods to 10% above the cost of that good. So shortly after this occurred, there was a major petroleum supplier who declared explicitly that it was going to halt shipments to West Virginia altogether because it simply wasn't worth their while economically to do them anymore, given the maximum price that was now in effect. And that's the troublesome thing about anti-gouging laws, right? They prohibit merchants from charging too much money from goods that they're selling, but they don't, and I mean, I guess they couldn't if they wanted to, prohibit merchants from just not selling the goods at all. And unfortunately, the less economically worthwhile you make selling by capping the prices, the more attractive not selling at all becomes as an option, even though it looks like that's the worst of all possible worlds for consumers.
Well, Matt, it's been great talking to you as always.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this, Dan. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thanks for your time.
Appreciate it.